Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, how does your evening unfold? Is there a lamp glowing softly beside you, the faint rustle of paper, the quiet comfort of tea in hand? Dr. Watson often found that such gentle moments revealed more than the busiest hours ever could. If you find solace in these reflections, do subscribe and join us again. Now, settle in, for it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, and if you wish to continue listening, you'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. Chapter 1. The Snowbound Summons. The winter of that year shall long remain in my memory as one of singular severity. London had vanished beneath a white shroud, and for 3 days the city had languished in the grip of frost so bitter that even the Thames showed patches of ice along its margins. It was upon the morning of the 4th day that I found myself seated opposite Sherlock Holmes, in a first-class carriage of the Great Western Railway, bound for a destination I had scarcely heard mentioned before that very dawn. Holmes sat in his customary attitude of repose, his lean figure wrapped in his travelling cloak, his sharp features turned toward the window where the landscape rolled past in an unbroken expanse of snow. He had spoken little since our hurried departure from Baker Street, and I knew him well enough to recognise that his silence betokened deep concentration rather than mere reserve. The summons had arrived shortly after breakfast, a telegram, terse and urgent, from a Mr. or Edmund Carruthers, solicitor, requesting Holmes's immediate attendance at Blackthorn Manor in Wiltshire. The matter, Carruthers had written, was delicate and required the utmost discretion. A second telegram had followed within the hour, informing us that a private carriage would await us at Westbury Station, as the roads beyond that point were impassable to all but the most determined conveyance. I had pressed Holmes for details during our preparations, but he had offered little beyond what the telegrams themselves conveyed. Now, as the train carried us westward through the frozen countryside, I ventured to break the silence. "Holmes," I said, "you have told me nothing of this Mr. Carruthers, nor of the nature of the case that calls us out in such inclement weather." He turned from the window, and I saw the faint smile that so often preceded one of his characteristic observations. "I have told you nothing, Watson, because there is as yet little to tell. Carruthers is a solicitor of excellent reputation, practising in Lincoln's Inn. He has handled the affairs of several old county families and is not a man given to flights of fancy. The fact that he has summoned us in such haste and in such conditions suggests a matter of genuine perplexity. But surely the telegrams gave some indication of the problem." "They gave indication only of urgency and discretion," Holmes replied. "The particulars, I suspect, will prove too delicate for the public telegraph. We shall learn them soon enough." He relapsed into silence, and I turned my own attention to the window. The landscape had grown increasingly desolate. Fields lay buried beneath drifts of snow, and the skeletal trees stood like sentinels against a leaden sky. Here and there a farmhouse chimney sent up a thin column of smoke, the only sign of human habitation in that frozen wilderness. We reached Westbury shortly before noon. The station was nearly deserted, but true to Carruthers' word, a sturdy closed carriage awaited us, drawn by a pair of heavy horses whose breath steamed in the frigid air. The driver, a weather-beaten man of middle years, touched his hat as we approached. "Mr. Holmes, sir?" he inquired. "Mr. Carruthers sent me to fetch you to Blackthorn Manor. It's a rough journey, I'll not deny, but the horses are fresh, and the runners are sound." "Runners?" I echoed. "Aye, sir," the man replied, gesturing toward the carriage. "We've fitted her with sled runners these past 2 days. The roads are buried deep, and wheels would founder before we'd gone a mile." I saw now that he spoke truly. The carriage had been modified for the conditions, its wheels replaced by broad wooden runners that would glide over the packed snow. Holmes nodded his approval, and we climbed aboard, settling ourselves beneath heavy fur robes as the driver took his place. The journey that followed was unlike any I had previously undertaken. The carriage moved with a strange, sliding motion over the snow-covered track, the runners hissing softly beneath us. On either side, the hedgerows had disappeared beneath the drifts, and the landscape had taken on an eerie uniformity. More than once I wondered how our driver maintained any sense of direction, yet he pressed forward with the confidence of one who knew every turn and landmark of the route. Holmes remained silent, his eyes half closed, but I knew that restless mind was far from idle. He was, I suspected, already constructing theories from the scant information we possessed, turning over possibilities, discarding the improbable, retaining only what accorded with the facts. We had travelled perhaps an hour when the manor came into view. It stood upon a slight rise, a handsome Georgian structure of honey-coloured stone, its many windows catching what little light the overcast sky afforded. The grounds were extensive, though now indistinguishable beneath the snow, and a line of tall elms marked what I took to be the drive. As we drew nearer, I could see that smoke rose from several chimneys, and light showed in many of the windows. The place had an air of quiet prosperity, yet there was something oppressive in its isolation. We were, I realised, quite cut off from the world, as effectively stranded as if we had been shipwrecked upon some remote shore. The carriage drew up before the main entrance, and the door opened immediately. A man emerged, elderly but upright, dressed in the sober black of a professional gentleman. His face bore the lines of habitual care, and his eyes, though keen, held a shadow of anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand, "I am Edmund Carruthers. I cannot adequately express my gratitude that you have undertaken this journey in such conditions." Holmes shook his hand briskly. "Your telegram suggested urgency, Mr. Carruthers. I trust we have not arrived too late." A flicker of something crossed the solicitor's face, relief perhaps, or possibly apprehension. "Not too late, no," he replied. "But the matter grows more complex with each passing hour. Please, come inside. You must be frozen through. There is a fire in the library and the household is assembled. They are eager, though perhaps also somewhat anxious, to make your acquaintance." We followed him into a spacious entrance hall, where a fire blazed in a great stone hearth. A servant took our outer garments, and I was grateful for the warmth that began to seep back into my limbs. Carruthers led us through a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress, until we reached a heavy oak door. He paused with his hand upon the latch and turned to Holmes. "Before we enter, Mr. Holmes, I should tell you that the family does not yet know the full nature of my concerns. They are aware only that certain irregularities in the probate documentation have come to light, irregularities that require expert examination. I thought it best to introduce you as a consultant in such matters, rather than as a detective." Holmes nodded. "A wise precaution, Mr. Carruthers. Watson and I are entirely at your disposal. But tell me, this household, how many souls does it comprise?" "Including servants, 17 in all," Carruthers replied. "But the family proper consists of 6 individuals, all of whom have remained here since the funeral a fortnight ago. The snow has made departure impossible for the past 4 days. And all stand to benefit from the estate." The solicitor hesitated. "That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely where the difficulty lies. But come, you shall form your own impressions." He opened the door, and we stepped into a room that would, in the days to come, become the theatre of one of my friend's most subtle and remarkable investigations. The library of Blackthorn Manor was a noble apartment, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books, a fire crackling in the marble fireplace. But it was not the room itself that held my attention. It was the 5 individuals who rose at our entrance, their faces turned toward us with expressions ranging from curiosity to what I could only describe as barely concealed apprehension. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. Chapter 2. A matter of inheritance. The 5 individuals who stood before us presented a study in contrasts, yet all bore the unmistakable stamp of good breeding and restrained emotion. I have often observed that English families of a certain class possess an almost theatrical ability to maintain composure in circumstances that would reduce lesser mortals to open distress, and the occupants of Blackthorn Manor were no exception. Mr. Carruthers performed the introductions with practised efficiency. The widow, Mrs. Leonora Blackthorne, was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair only lightly touched with grey, and eyes that held a curious mixture of grief and watchfulness. She acknowledged our presence with a slight inclination of her head, her black morning dress rustling faintly as she resumed her seat near the fire. Her stepson, Mr. Geoffrey Blackthorne, stood by the window, a tall man of 30 years with the bearing of one accustomed to authority. His resemblance to the portraits in the corridor suggested he favoured his late father in appearance, though his expression held a wariness that spoke of recent strain. Miss Arabella Blackthorne, the daughter of the deceased, occupied a chair near her stepmother. She was perhaps 25, possessed of delicate features and an air of quiet intelligence. Her hands, I noted, were clasped tightly in her lap, and she studied Holmes with undisguised interest. The cousin, Mr. Philip Ashworth, had stationed himself near the book-lined walls. He was a man of middle years, somewhat corpulent, with the florid complexion of one who enjoyed his creature comforts. His attitude suggested a familiarity with the house that went beyond that of a mere visitor. Finally, there was Mr. Thomas Garrett, identified by Carruthers as the estate steward. He stood slightly apart from the family, as befitted his position, a lean man of 60 with the weathered features of one who spent his days out of doors. His presence in what was clearly a family conference spoke to his long service and trusted status. Holmes swept the room with that penetrating gaze I knew so well, taking in not merely the individuals but their positions, their attitudes, the very air of tension that hung over the gathering like a palpable thing. Mr. Carruthers has informed us that certain questions have arisen regarding the late Mr. Blackthorne's estate, Holmes began, his voice even and businesslike. Dr. Watson and I are here at his request to examine the documentation and offer what assistance we may. I trust our presence causes no offence. It was Geoffrey Blackthorne who answered. No offence whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. If there are irregularities, as Mr. Carruthers suggests, then we are all equally anxious to see them resolved. My father was a man of scrupulous honesty, and I should not wish any shadow to fall upon his final wishes. Quite so, murmured the widow, though her tone suggested less conviction than her stepson's words. Holmes turned to the solicitor. Perhaps, Mr. Carruthers, you might explain the precise nature of these irregularities. The solicitor moved to a large desk that stood between two windows. Upon it lay several documents, which he now indicated with a gesture. The late Mr. Henry Blackthorne passed away on the 14th of January, he began. His will was perfectly straightforward, and had been in my keeping for some 7 years. The estate, which is considerable, was divided according to clear instructions. Mrs. Blackthorne receives the manor house and an annuity for her lifetime. Mr. Geoffrey Blackthorne inherits the bulk of the property and investments. Miss Arabella receives a substantial settlement. Mr. Ashworth, as a cousin who assisted with the management of certain business interests, receives a legacy of £5,000. Mr. Garrett is provided for with a cottage and pension. All very proper, Holmes observed. Yet something troubles you. Carruthers picked up a document bearing an impressive seal. The probate certificate was filed with the appropriate court 1 week ago. It is this certificate that concerns me. The validation appears to be in order, yet when I examined it closely 2 days ago, certain details gave me pause. What manner of details? Holmes asked, his eyes suddenly intent. The solicitor hesitated. They are subtle, Mr. Holmes. So subtle that I initially dismissed them as products of my own excessive caution. The seal itself, for instance, appears genuine, yet its impression is not quite as sharp as one would expect from the court seal I have observed on dozens of previous occasions. The date of validation, while possible, seems curiously expedited given the current state of the courts. There is a notation in the margin that employs a phrase I have never before encountered in probate documentation. Holmes crossed to the desk and took up the certificate, holding it to the light, examining it from various angles. I watched as his fingers traced the seal with delicate precision, as his eyes narrowed in concentration. "You have the original will?" he asked. "Here," Carruthers replied, producing another document. "As you will see, it is entirely straightforward. I drafted it myself in Mr. Blackthorne's presence, and it was properly witnessed by 2 clerks from my firm, neither of whom had any interest in the estate, and the death was certified without complication." "Dr. Morrison attended Mr. Blackthorne in his final illness," the widow interjected, her voice controlled but touched with emotion. "It was pneumonia, contracted during a particularly severe cold spell in early January. He declined rapidly. The doctor can confirm that everything was entirely natural." "I have no doubt of it, madam," Holmes replied courteously. "My concern is not with the death itself, but with the documentation that followed. Mr. Carruthers, you mentioned that the household has been snowbound for 4 days. When did you yourself last leave the manor?" "I arrived 3 days before the snow began," the solicitor answered. "My purpose was to read the will to the assembled family and to ensure that all affairs were properly in order. I had intended to return to London once the initial formalities were complete, but the weather trapped us all here. And the probate certificate, when did it arrive?" A shadow crossed Carruthers' face. "That is perhaps the most curious aspect of the matter, Mr. Holmes. It was discovered in the study, in a locked drawer of Mr. Blackthorne's desk on the morning after the first heavy snowfall. Mr. Geoffrey found it while searching for certain business papers his father had mentioned." Geoffrey Blackthorne stepped forward. "I was as surprised as anyone, Mr. Holmes. The drawer had been locked and I used my father's keys, which had been returned to me after his death. The certificate was lying atop other documents, as though recently placed there. Yet it purports to have been validated by the court in London," Holmes observed. "How then did it come to be in this locked drawer when no one has entered or left the manor since the snow began?" The question hung in the air unanswered. I saw glances exchanged between the family members, subtle movements that spoke of unease. Holmes returned the certificate to the desk and turned to face the room. "I shall require certain information from each of you," he announced. "Not accusations, you understand, but simple matters of fact. Who has had access to this study since Mr. Blackthorne's death? Who possesses keys to the various rooms? What was the precise sequence of events surrounding the discovery of this document?" Mr. Garrett cleared his throat. "The study was kept locked after the master's death, Mr. Holmes. It was his sanctuary, and Mrs. Blackthorne felt it should remain undisturbed until the will had been properly read. Only Mr. Geoffrey and myself held keys, beyond the master's own ring, and yet the certificate appeared," Holmes mused. "Most singular." Philip Ashworth shifted his weight, and I detected a note of impatience in his voice when he spoke. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, the explanation is simple enough. Some clerk from the court must have delivered it before the snow came. Perhaps it was left with a servant who placed it in the study without informing anyone." Holmes regarded him with an expression of mild interest. "An ingenious theory, Mr. Ashworth. Tell me, do you spend much time at Blackthorne Manor?" "I visit several times each year," the cousin replied, a touch defensively. "And I have business interests in the county, and Henry, my late cousin, often consulted me on financial matters." "I see. And on this visit, when did you arrive?" "The day after the funeral. I had attended, of course, and then returned to my lodgings in Salisbury. But when Mr. Carruthers mentioned he would be reading the will, I thought it proper to be present." Holmes nodded absently, but I could see his mind was racing ahead, processing details, cataloguing inconsistencies. He moved about the room now, examining the windows, the door, the very fabric of the space with that methodical thoroughness I had witnessed in 100 investigations. The family watched him with varying degrees of anxiety. Only Miss Arabella seemed fascinated rather than disturbed by his scrutiny. "Mr. Holmes," she ventured, "do you suspect some form of deception?" Holmes paused in his examination of the doorframe and turned to her with a slight smile. "I suspect nothing yet, Miss Blackthorne. I merely observe. But I will say this. When a legal document of great consequence appears in a locked room under impossible circumstances, While a household of interested parties remains trapped together by inclement weather, it becomes incumbent upon a reasoning mind to question the appearance of things. He returned to the desk and gathered up both the will and the certificate. "With your permission, Mr. Carruthers, I should like to examine these more closely in private. Dr. Watson and I will require a room where we may work undisturbed. The library annex would serve," the solicitor suggested. "It is quite comfortable, and you will not be interrupted." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "And I would ask that nothing in this study be disturbed until I have had opportunity to examine it thoroughly. The locked drawer in particular must remain exactly as Mr. Geoffrey found it." As we followed Carruthers from the room, I glanced back at the family. They remained frozen in their various attitudes, a tableau of suspicion and unspoken thoughts. Whatever secrets Blackthorn Manor held, I knew that Holmes would uncover them. The question that troubled me was how many of those assembled souls were party to the deception, and how far they might go to preserve it. Chapter 3. The Locked Study. The library annex proved to be a comfortable chamber, smaller than the main room but well appointed, with a writing table positioned to catch the pale winter light from a mullioned window. Carruthers left us there with the documents and a promise that we should not be disturbed until dinner, which was served at 7. Holmes wasted no time in spreading the papers before him. He produced his lens from an inner pocket and began a minute examination of the probate certificate, his face so close to the document that his breath might have disturbed it. Had he not held himself with that peculiar stillness he could maintain for hours when absorbed in his work. I settled myself in a chair by the fire and watched him, knowing that any interruption would be unwelcome. Outside, the short winter afternoon was already fading into dusk, and snow had begun to fall again, the flakes drifting past the window in lazy spirals. After perhaps 20 minutes of silence, Holmes straightened and reached for his pipe. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of our assembled company?" I considered the question carefully. "They seem a typical family of the upper middle class," I replied. "The widow maintains her dignity despite her loss. The son appears genuinely concerned about his father's reputation. The daughter strikes me as intelligent and observant. As for the cousin and the steward, I confess I have formed no strong impression of either." Holmes smiled faintly. "You describe what you see, my dear fellow, which is admirable in its way. But you do not yet observe. Consider Mrs. Blackthorn's hands. Did you notice them?" I was obliged to admit that I had not paid them particular attention. "They were entirely steady," Holmes continued. "A woman recently widowed facing questions about her husband's estate might be expected to show some nervous agitation, yet she displayed none. Either she possesses remarkable self-control, or the death of her husband has occasioned less grief than appearances suggest. Perhaps she's simply of a stoic temperament," I ventured. "Perhaps," Holmes agreed. "But note also that she deferred to her stepson in matters concerning the study. Why should that be? As the widow, she's mistress of this house, yet she allows Geoffrey Blackthorn to take the lead in all practical matters. That speaks either to unusual humility or to some understanding between them." He returned his attention to the certificate, holding it up to the light once more. "This document, Watson, is a masterpiece of near perfection. The paper is correct. The seal is correct in all but the most minute details, and the language is precisely what one would expect. Yet it is wrong. How can you be certain?" Holmes pointed to the seal with the stem of his pipe. "The impression is slightly too uniform. A genuine seal, applied by hand, shows minute variations in pressure. This was made by a press, I should say, or by some mechanical means that allowed for perfect consistency. Moreover, the wax itself has a faint odour that suggests it is not of the composition typically used by the courts." He set down the certificate and took up the will, reading through it with rapid attention. "The will itself is beyond reproach," he announced. "Carruthers drafted it competently, and the witnesses are clearly identified. The division of the estate is logical, and shows no sign of coercion or undue influence. If there is deception here, it centres entirely upon the probate certificate." "But to what end?" I asked. "The will is valid. The certificate merely confirms what is already established." "Ah," Holmes replied, "that is indeed the question. Why forge a document that changes nothing? Unless, of course, it does change something, in some manner we do not yet perceive." He rose abruptly and gathered up the papers. "Come, Watson. I wish to examine the study before the light fails entirely." We found Mr. Garrett in the entrance hall, engaged in quiet conversation with one of the servants. He looked up at our approach. "Mr. Holmes, how may I assist you?" "I wish to examine Mr. Blackthorne's study," Holmes informed him. "I understand you hold a key." The steward's weathered face showed no emotion as he produced a keyring from his pocket. "I do, sir. Shall I accompany you?" "If you would be so kind." Garrett led us down a corridor that branched from the main hall, our footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The study occupied a corner position on the ground floor with windows facing both east and south. The steward unlocked the door and stood aside. "Nothing has been disturbed since Mr. Geoffrey discovered the certificate," he said. "Mrs. Blackthorne gave strict instructions. The room beyond was precisely what one would expect of a country gentleman of means and methodical habits. Shelves lined 2 walls, filled with account books and volumes on agriculture and estate management. A large mahogany desk dominated the centre of the room, its surface bare save for an inkstand and a blotter. 2 leather chairs flanked a small fireplace, now cold and dark. Holmes entered with the air of a man approaching a shrine. He moved slowly, his eyes taking in every detail, every object, every inch of space. "This drawer, Mr. Garrett. Show me precisely which one contained the certificate." The steward approached the desk and indicated the upper right drawer. "This one, sir." It was locked, as I said, and Mr. Geoffrey used his father's keys to open it. Holmes knelt and examined the lock with his lens, then gently pulled the drawer open. It was perhaps 8 inches deep and ran the full width of the desk. Inside lay several bundles of correspondence tied with ribbon and a leather portfolio. "These were undisturbed?" Holmes asked. "So Mr. Geoffrey stated, sir. The certificate lay atop them," he said, "as though placed there recently." Holmes removed the contents piece by piece, examining each item before setting it carefully aside. When the drawer was empty, he studied its interior with minute attention, running his fingers along the joints, ere pressing gently at various points. "Watson," he said suddenly, "observe the depth of this drawer from the inside." I bent to look. It appeared to be of normal depth. "Now, observe it from the outside." I moved to examine the exterior face of the drawer. The discrepancy was slight but unmistakable. The external depth exceeded the internal by perhaps 2 inches. "A false bottom," I exclaimed. "Quite so," Holmes replied, "or rather, a hidden compartment." "Mr. Garrett, did your late master ever mention such a feature?" The steward's expression had shifted from neutrality to surprise. "Never, Mr. Holmes. I knew the master for 30 years, and he never spoke of any such thing." Holmes pressed at various points along the drawer's base, his fingers moving with surgical precision. I heard a faint click, and a section of the bottom lifted away, to revealing a shallow space beneath. Within lay 3 items: a stick of dark red sealing wax, a small brass seal mounted on a wooden handle, and a folded sheet of paper. Holmes lifted each object with care, examining them in turn. The seal, I noted, bore an intricate design that even to my untrained eye appeared official in character. He unfolded the paper and read it in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the paper. It was a letter written in a feminine hand, undated and unsigned, but its content was unmistakable. It spoke of gratitude for assistance rendered, of an understanding maintained in confidence, and of hope for a future unburdened by the past. The language was circumspect, but the implication was clear. Someone in this house had been conducting an affair of a clandestine nature. Holmes turned to Garrett, who had gone quite pale. "Mr. Garrett, I must ask you to say nothing of what we have discovered here. Not to the family, not to Mr. Carruthers, not to anyone. Do I have your word?" "You have it, sir," the steward replied, his voice strained, "though I confess I am shaken. The master was a man of the strictest probity." "So I have been told," Holmes said, quietly. "Yet the evidence before us suggests complications in his character or circumstances. Watson, please replace these items exactly as we found them. Mr. Garrett, I should like you to lock this drawer and give me the key. I shall return it when my investigation is complete." When these instructions had been carried out, Holmes conducted a thorough examination of the rest of the study. He paid particular attention to the windows, testing the latches, examining the frames, even studying the snow that had accumulated on the outer sills. He inspected the fireplace, the carpet, the very walls themselves. Finally, he turned his attention to a small table that stood between the two chairs. Upon it sat a wooden box containing various smoking materials. Holmes opened it and lifted out a pipe, holding it to his nose. "Turkish tobacco," he murmured, "of an expensive variety." "Mr. Garrett, did your master smoke?" "Rarely, sir. He kept the box for guests who might wish to smoke. Mr. Ashworth, in particular, was fond of a pipe after dinner." Holmes replaced the pipe and lifted the box itself, examining its underside. A small amount of ash had collected in one corner. He touched it with his finger and brought it close to his face. "Most interesting," he said, though whether to himself or to us I could not determine. When at last we returned to the annex, Holmes was silent and withdrawn. He stood by the window, staring out at the falling snow, his fingers drumming against the glass in that restless rhythm that indicated intense mental activity. "Watson," he said at length, "we are dealing with a mind of considerable subtlety. The probate certificate is a forgery, of that I am now certain. But it is a forgery created not to alter the disposition of the estate, but to conceal something else entirely. What that something is, I cannot yet say. But I am convinced that the answer lies not in what the certificate states, but in what its very existence prevents us from examining too closely." He turned from the window, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar light that always appeared when he scented the truth beneath layers of deception. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall interview each member of this household separately. I wish to know where each was at specific times, what each observed, and what each has chosen not to mention. Someone in this house created that certificate, placed it in that locked drawer, and contrived its discovery. Until we know who and why, we are merely observers at a performance whose final act has yet to be played." Chapter 4. The Impossible Seal. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. The household assembled in the dining room at the appointed hour, and though the meal itself was well prepared and elegantly served, conversation remained stilted and occasional. Holmes said little, contenting himself with observation, or while I attempted to maintain some semblance of normal discourse with Miss Blackthorne, who sat to my right. She proved an intelligent conversationalist, well-read and possessed of decided opinions on various subjects. Yet even as she spoke of books and music, I detected an underlying strain in her manner, a watchfulness that suggested her mind was occupied with matters far removed from our polite exchange. Across the table, Philip Ashworth consumed his meal with evident appetite, pausing between courses to regale Geoffrey Blackthorne with anecdotes of business ventures in the colonies. The younger man listened with dutiful attention, though his responses were brief, and his gaze occasionally strayed to his stepmother, who sat at the head of the table in silent dignity. Mrs. Blackthorne had changed for dinner into a gown of black silk that rustled softly when she moved. Her composure remained absolute, and she presided over the meal with the practised ease of one accustomed to managing social occasions. Only once did I observe a crack in her facade, when Carruthers mentioned, quite innocently, some detail of her late husband's business affairs. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her wineglass, though she recovered herself immediately. After the ladies had withdrawn, the gentleman lingered over port. It was then that Ashworth, emboldened perhaps by wine, addressed Holmes directly. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, have you formed any conclusions about this curious business of the certificate?" Holmes swirled the port in his glass, watching the candlelight play through the ruby liquid. "I have formed several conclusions, Mr. Ashworth, though I am not yet prepared to share them." "Come now," the cousin persisted. "Surely you can offer some indication. Are we dealing with a simple clerical error, or something more sinister?" "The distinction between simple and sinister," Holmes replied evenly, "often depends upon one's perspective. What appears innocent to one observer may reveal darker implications to another." Geoffrey Blackthorne leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, I must know, do you suspect that someone in this house has acted dishonestly?" "I suspect," Holmes said, "that someone has acted with great cleverness. Whether dishonestly remains to be determined." The silence that followed was broken by Carruthers, who cleared his throat diplomatically. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should rejoin the ladies. Mr. Holmes has assured me he will share his findings when his investigation is complete." We returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Blackthorne and her stepdaughter had settled near the fire. The evening passed with painful slowness, marked by desultory conversation and long silences. At 10 o'clock the household began to disperse, each member retiring with expressions of fatigue that seemed entirely genuine. Holmes and I were shown to adjacent bedchambers on the second floor. My room was comfortable enough, with a fire burning cheerfully and thick curtains drawn against the winter night. I prepared for bed, but sleep eluded me. The events of the day churned in my mind, and I found myself reviewing each detail, searching for the pattern that I knew Holmes had already begun to perceive, and I'd perhaps dozed fitfully for an hour when a soft knock at my door brought me fully awake. I lit the bedside candle and found Holmes standing in the corridor, fully dressed, a candle of his own in his hand. "Watson," he whispered, "I require your assistance. Bring your warmest coat." Within minutes we were descending the main staircase, moving with the stealth born of long practice. The house lay silent around us, though I could hear the wind howling beyond the walls and the occasional crack of timber contracting in the cold. Holmes led me to the study. He produced the key Garrett had given him and unlocked the door. Once inside, he relit several lamps and went directly to the desk. "I have been conducting an experiment in my chamber," he explained, keeping his voice low. The seal we discovered in the hidden compartment troubled me. Its design was too elaborate, too official in appearance to be a mere personal seal. I sketched it from memory and compared it to my knowledge of various institutional seals. He withdrew the seal from the drawer and placed it on the desk beside a sheet of paper bearing his sketch. "Observe, Watson, this is not a court seal, nor is it the seal of any legal institution with which I am familiar. Yet it is unquestionably official in character. See here, the elaborate border, the Latin inscription, the heraldic elements. This required professional engraving." "What does the inscription say?" I asked. "Veritas vincit," Holmes replied. "Truth conquers." A noble sentiment, yet curiously inappropriate for a forged probate certificate. He took up the stick of sealing wax and held it to the lamp flame, allowing several drops to fall onto a blank sheet. Then, with practiced movements, he pressed the seal into the warm wax and lifted it cleanly. The result was a perfect impression, crisp and detailed. Holmes compared it to the seal on the probate certificate, using his lens to examine both with minute care. "Identical," he announced. "This seal created the impression on that certificate, but observe the condition of the wax stick. It has been used recently and repeatedly. See these slight variations in colour along its length? They indicate exposure to flame at different times. Someone has practised with this seal, Watson, perfecting the technique before applying it to the final document." "But how did the certificate itself come to be here?" I asked. "You said the paper was correct, the language proper. Surely such a document could not be produced within this house." Holmes smiled grimly. "Could it not? Consider what we know." Mr. Carruthers arrived 3 days before the snow began. He brought with him various legal documents, including blank forms and official papers. It is his practice, he told me at dinner, to prepare such documents in advance when visiting clients in remote locations. A blank probate certificate would have been among his materials. "Good heavens," I exclaimed. "You suspect Carruthers himself?" "Not necessarily," Holmes replied. "But someone with access to his documents could have taken a blank certificate, filled it with the appropriate information, and sealed it with this false seal. The result would appear entirely genuine to a casual observer, or even to a careful one who did not know precisely what details to question." He returned the seal to its hiding place and restored the drawer to its locked state. "The critical question, Watson, is not how the forgery was accomplished, but when. The certificate purports to have been validated on the 23rd of January. That was 5 days ago, and 2 days after the snow began. No one has entered or left this house since the 21st. Therefore, if the certificate was forged here, it could not have been validated in London on the date it claims. Unless," I ventured, "it was forged before the snow began, by someone who then returned to place it in the drawer." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. Mr. Jeffrey discovered the certificate on the morning of the 22nd. If it had been placed there before the snow began, it would have been dated earlier. The forger dated it after the household was sealed off from the outside world, which suggests either breathtaking audacity or a fatal miscalculation." He moved to the windows and examined the latches once more, then turned his attention to the fireplace. He knelt and peered up the chimney, holding his candle high. "As I suspected," he murmured. "This flue connects to the amine chimney stack, which serves several rooms. A person of slender build might conceivably navigate it, though not without considerable discomfort and risk." "Surely you don't suggest someone entered through the chimney?" I protested. "I suggest nothing yet," Holmes replied, rising and brushing soot from his hands. "I merely note that this room, which appears entirely secure, may not be as inaccessible as it seems." We returned to the corridor, and Holmes locked the study behind us. As we mounted the stairs, I ventured a question that had been troubling me. "Holmes, if the certificate is forged, what purpose does it serve? The will is valid. The beneficiaries are clearly identified. What could anyone gain by creating a false probate document?" My friend paused on the landing, his face half in shadow. "That, Watson, is the heart of the mystery. The obvious answer is that someone wishes to delay or complicate the distribution of the estate. But I begin to suspect a more subtle motive. Consider. If questions are raised about the probate certificate, what follows? The entire estate comes under closer scrutiny. Documents are examined, affairs are reviewed, questions are asked that might otherwise never arise. You believe someone wishes the estate to be investigated?" "I believe someone wishes something to be discovered," Holmes said slowly. "Or perhaps to remain hidden while attention is directed elsewhere. We are dealing with a mind that thinks in layers, Watson. What appears on the surface is merely a distraction from what lies beneath." We parted at our respective doors, and I returned to my bed. But sleep remained elusive. I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the settling of the old house, and wondered what secrets these walls concealed. Holmes had uncovered the mechanism of the forgery, but the motive remained obscure, and until we understood why the certificate had been created, we could not hope to identify who had created it. The game, as Holmes would say, was far from over. Indeed. I had the distinct impression that we had only just glimpsed the opening moves of a strategy whose full complexity had yet to be revealed. Chapter 5. Observations over Words. The following morning dawned grey and bitter. I descended to breakfast to find the dining room already occupied by several members of the household, though Holmes's chair remained conspicuously empty. Miss Blackthorne informed me that she had seen him an hour earlier, walking the perimeter of the house despite the cold, his collar turned up against the wind. He returned as I was finishing my coffee, his cheeks reddened by the weather, and his eyes bright with that peculiar energy that always accompanied active investigation. He declined food, but accepted tea, which he drank standing by the window, his gaze fixed upon the snow-covered grounds. Mr. Carruthers appeared shortly thereafter, and Holmes requested the use of the morning room for private interviews with each member of the household. The solicitor agreed readily, though I detected a certain apprehension in his manner. The morning room proved ideal for Holmes's purposes. It was a pleasant chamber on the south side of the house, with good light and a comfortable arrangement of furniture. Holmes positioned himself in a chair that commanded a view of both the door and the window, while I took up station at a small writing desk, ready to make notes as required. Our first interview was with Mr. Garrett. The steward entered with his customary dignity, settling himself in the chair Holmes indicated with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the cold. Holmes began not with questions but with a simple request. "Mr. Garrett, would you be so kind as to describe your typical daily routine when Mr. Blackthorne was alive?" The steward required no prompting. For 30 years, Mr. Holmes, my days followed the same pattern. I rose at 6, regardless of season, and made my first inspection of the grounds. At 7 I breakfasted in my cottage. By 8 I was in the estate office, reviewing accounts and correspondence. Mr. Blackthorne would join me there at 9, and we would discuss the day's business. He was a man of method, sir, and valued punctuality above all virtues. And in the evenings? I dined at 6 in my cottage, unless specifically invited to join the family, which occurred perhaps once a fortnight. After dinner, I would often return to the office to complete any unfinished work. Mr. Blackthorne sometimes joined me there, particularly in winter, when he found the main house too quiet for his liking. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "When did you last see Mr. Blackthorne alive?" "The evening before his death, sir. He came to the office at 8 o'clock, which was unusual. He seemed agitated, which was more unusual still. He asked me to witness his signature on a document, which I did, though he did not show me its contents." "What manner of document?" "A single sheet, folded and sealed. He placed it in his pocket immediately after I'd signed." Holmes's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Did he say anything about this document?" "Only that it concerned a private matter that weighed upon his conscience." He thanked me for my discretion and returned to the house. The next morning, Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, sent word that the master had taken ill in the night. Holmes questioned him further about the study, the keys, the habits of various household members. Throughout I observed not merely Garrett's words, but his demeanour. He sat upright, his hands resting quietly in his lap, his gaze direct and unwavering. If he dissembled, he did so with remarkable skill. When the steward had departed, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. An interesting man, Watson. Loyal, methodical, and possessed of information he has not yet chosen to share. Did you note his hands? I confessed I had not paid them particular attention. They are the hands of a man who works outdoors, Holmes observed. Weathered, calloused, yet scrupulously clean. A man who takes pride in his appearance despite the nature of his labour. And did you observe his reaction when I mentioned the document Blackthorne had him witness? The slightest tightening around his eyes quickly suppressed. He knows more of that paper than he admits. Our next interview was with Philip Ashworth. The cousin entered with an air of bonhomie that seemed studied rather than natural. He settled himself with a sigh and produced a cigar case, which he opened with questioning look toward Holmes. "By all means," Holmes replied. Ashworth lit his cigar with evident satisfaction and leaned back in his chair. "I must say, Mr. Holmes, this entire business strikes me as much ado about nothing. A minor irregularity in a legal document, perhaps a clerk's error, blown entirely out of proportion. You are familiar with legal documents, Mr. Ashworth?" "I am a man of business, Mr. Holmes. It is I have reviewed more contracts and certificates than I care to count. One develops an eye for such things." Holmes shifted in his chair. "Tell me about your relationship with your late cousin." "Henry and I were close in our youth," Ashworth replied. "We drifted apart in our middle years, as men often do when their paths diverge. I pursued opportunities in the colonies, while he remained here, managing the estate. In recent years we had renewed our connection. He valued my advice on financial matters. You visited frequently, several times each year. I always stayed in the East Wing, in the Blue Room. Henry was a generous host, and we would spend our evenings in the study discussing investments and opportunities. He trusted my judgment implicitly. Holmes appeared to consider this. And Mrs. Blackthorne, how did she view your visits? For the first time, Ashworth's composure faltered slightly. Leonora was always most gracious, he said carefully, though I sensed she found my conversations with Henry somewhat tedious. Ladies rarely share our enthusiasm for matters of business. Quite so, Holmes murmured. Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, do you smoke a pipe as well as cigars? The question appeared to surprise him. Occasionally, yes. Henry kept a selection of tobaccos in the study for guests. I am particularly fond of a Turkish blend he acquired. The interview continued, but I sensed that Holmes had gleaned what he sought. When Ashworth departed, trailing cigar smoke, my friend rose and paced to the window. A man of appetites, Watson. Note how quickly he made himself comfortable, how readily he assumed familiarity. Yet beneath the affability lies calculation. He mentioned the Blue Room unprompted. Why should he specify which room he occupied unless he wished to establish his presence in a particular part of the house? Mrs. Blackthorne arrived precisely at the appointed hour. She entered with quiet grace, her widow's weeds rustling softly, and seated herself with the erect posture of one schooled in deportment. Her face, though composed, showed signs of strain that had not been evident the previous day. Holmes conducted this interview with particular delicacy. He asked about her late husband's habits, his health, his state of mind in the weeks before his death. She answered with precision, her voice steady, though I noticed her hands clasped and unclasped in her lap. When Holmes inquired about the study, however, her composure wavered. My husband valued his privacy, Mr. Holmes. The study was his sanctuary. I respected that throughout our marriage. You never entered it. Only when specifically invited, which was rare. Henry conducted his business there, and I had no wish to intrude. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Blackthorne, did your husband seem troubled in the days before his death? She was silent for a long moment. My husband, she said at last, was a man of strong principles. When he believed he had acted wrongly, he could not rest until he had made amends. In his final weeks, he seemed burdened by some private concern. I asked him about it, but he would not confide in me. Did he mention any document, any paper that weighed upon his mind? Her eyes met Holmes's directly. He spoke once of a letter he had written but not sent. He said it concerned an old wrong that required acknowledgement. I assumed he referred to some business matter. Holmes thanked her and rose, signalling the interview's end. As she reached the door, he spoke again. Mrs. Blackthorne, one final question. On the evening of the 21st, after the snow began, where were you between the hours of 8 and midnight? She turned her hand upon the doorframe. I retired to my chamber at 9 o'clock, Mr. Holmes. I read for perhaps an hour and then slept. My maid can confirm the time, as she attended me before I dismissed her. When she'd gone, Holmes resumed his pacing. Watson, he said, we are dealing with individuals who pass their words with legal precision. Each tells the truth, yet each conceals something vital. Garrett witnessed a document. Ashworth establishes his familiarity with the study. Mrs. Blackthorne admits her husband was troubled, yet claims ignorance of the cause. They are pieces of a puzzle, but the picture they form remains obscure. The remaining interviews followed in succession. Geoffrey Blackthorne spoke of his father with evident affection and confusion over the probate irregularities. Miss Arabella demonstrated remarkable perception, noting details of household routine that her brother had overlooked. Each conversation added fragments to Holmes's growing understanding, yet I could see the solution still eluded him. As the afternoon waned and the last interview concluded, Holmes stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall once more. Watson, he said quietly, I have learned much today, though not from what was said. I've learned it from glances withheld, from careful phrasing, from the small betrayals of gesture and expression. Someone in this house knows the truth of that certificate. Someone knows what document Henry Blackthorne had witnessed the night before he died, and someone knows why the truth must remain hidden, even at the cost of elaborate deception. He turned to face me, and I saw determination hardening in his features. Tomorrow, Watson, we reconstruct the evening of the 21st. We shall trace each person's movements, account for every hour, and discover what occurred in this house while the snow sealed us all within its walls. Chapter 6. Movements in Silence. The task Holmes had set for himself proved more formidable than I had anticipated. To reconstruct the movements of 7 individuals through a large house over the course of an evening required not merely the collection of statements, but the verification of each claim through physical evidence and logical deduction. He began immediately after breakfast the next morning by requesting a complete plan of the house from Mr. Garrett. The steward produced a set of architectural drawings from the estate office, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. Holmes spread these across the table in the library annex and studied them with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "Watson," he said, tracing his finger along the corridors, "observe the layout. The family bedchambers occupy the second floor here and here. The servants' quarters are in the attic and the north wing. The ground floor contains the public rooms, the study and the estate office. Now, on the evening of the 21st after dinner, where was each person?" I consulted my notes from the previous day's interviews. Mrs. Blackthorne claimed she retired at 9. Geoffrey was in the billiard room until 10, or so he states. Miss Arabella was in the drawing room reading. Ashworth says he was in his chamber writing letters. Carruthers was reviewing documents in his own room. And Garrett, in his cottage, beyond the main house. Holmes nodded slowly. Yet someone moved through this house that evening. Someone accessed the study, obtained Carruthers's blank probate certificate, filled it with careful forgery, sealed it with the hidden seal, and placed it in the locked drawer, all while maintaining the appearance of normal evening routine. He rose and beckoned me to follow. "We shall retrace probable routes, Watson. Note everything." For the next 2 hours, Holmes conducted what can only be described as a physical investigation of exceptional thoroughness. We walked every corridor, examined every staircase, tested every floorboard. He paid particular attention to which boards creaked and which remained silent, which doors could be opened without sound, and which announced themselves with protesting hinges. In the corridor outside the study he paused and knelt, examining the floor with his lens. "Watson, observe this slight discoloration in the wood. It is fresh polish, applied within the past week. Yet the rest of this corridor shows no such treatment. Why should one particular section receive attention? Perhaps something was spilled." "Perhaps," Holmes agreed. "Or perhaps something needed to be obscured." He proceeded to the study itself and unlocked it once more. Inside, he went directly to the desk and removed the hidden seal and wax from their compartment. He held the wax stick to the light, turning it slowly. "This wax has been used at least 4 times in recent days," he announced. "See here and here the marks where it was held to flame. Each use leaves a characteristic pattern. Someone practiced extensively before creating the final seal on the certificate." "But surely that would require time," I observed, "and privacy. One cannot sit in a public room melting wax and pressing seals without drawing attention." "Precisely, Watson. Which tells us that whoever created this forgery had access to a private space where they could work undisturbed for extended periods. A bedchamber, perhaps, or a room not commonly frequented by others." He replaced the items and locked the drawer, then turned his attention to the fireplace. He examined the grate, the hearth, the very bricks themselves. Then he lay flat upon the floor and peered up the chimney, holding his candle high. When he emerged, his face bore traces of soot, but also of satisfaction. "As I suspected," he said. "The chimney flue shows signs of recent disturbance. Soot has been dislodged from the walls, and there are marks consistent with something being lowered or raised through the shaft. You believe someone entered through the chimney? Holmes brushed off his coat. I believe the chimney was used, though perhaps not for entry. Consider, Watson, if one wished to move an object from one floor to another without being observed in the corridors, what better conduit than a chimney flue that connects multiple rooms? The ingenuity of it struck me immediately. Of course, one could lower an item from an upper floor directly into the study, or raise one from the study to an upper floor, Holmes added. The chimney in this study connects to the main stack, which serves bedchambers on the second floor. I noted the configuration when we first examined the plans. We ascended to the second floor where Holmes identified which rooms shared the chimney connection. They included the blue room, where Ashworth lodged, and curiously a small sitting room adjacent to Mrs. Blackthorne's chamber. Holmes requested permission to examine these rooms. Mrs. Blackthorne granted it with evident reluctance, though she insisted on accompanying us. In her sitting room, Holmes went immediately to the fireplace. It was smaller than the one in the study. It is designed for a coal fire rather than logs. He knelt and examined the grate with minute attention. "Mrs. Blackthorne," he asked, "when was a fire last lit in this grate?" She considered. "Not for several days, Mr. Holmes. I prefer the warmth of my bedchamber hearth. This room I use primarily during the day." Holmes nodded but said nothing further. When she'd withdrawn, however, he pointed to the bricks at the back of the fireplace. "Fresh soot marks, Watson. And observe this." He reached into the flue and withdrew a length of fine cord, blackened by soot but unmistakably silk. Someone lowered something through this chimney within the past few days. But what? And why? "Questions we shall answer," Holmes replied, pocketing the cord. "But first, let us examine the blue room." Ashworth was absent, having gone to the library to read. His chamber was well appointed, with a large fireplace and windows overlooking the south lawn. Holmes examined this fireplace with equal care, but found nothing of immediate interest. As we were preparing to leave, however, his attention was caught by a writing desk positioned near the window. Upon it lay several sheets of paper, an inkwell, and scattered pens. Holmes examined the papers without touching them. "Business correspondence," he murmured. "Invoices, contracts, letters of credit, all perfectly ordinary. Yet observe, Watson, the ink in this well." I looked closely. It appeared to be standard black ink. "Standard? Yes," Holmes agreed. "But note the level. The well is nearly empty, yet Ashworth claims to have been writing letters on the evening of the 21st. A lengthy correspondence would have required refilling the well. Yet I see no evidence of a spare bottle in this room. Perhaps he writes brief letters. Perhaps, Holmes said, or perhaps he was writing something else entirely." He turned his attention to the wastepaper basket beside the desk. It contained several crumpled papers, which he extracted and smoothed carefully upon the desk surface. They proved to be drafts of the same letter, each abandoned after a few lines, each beginning with the same formal salutation. "The handwriting, Watson. Note its character." I examined the script. It was neat and precise, the hand of a man accustomed to business writing. "Now observe this," Holmes said, producing from his pocket the folded letter we'd found in the study's hidden compartment. "Compare the two hands." The difference was subtle but unmistakable. The letter from the hidden compartment, though similarly neat, showed certain flourishes and characteristics that did not appear in Ashworth's drafts. "Different hands," I confirmed. "Different authors," Holmes agreed, which tells us that the letter in the hidden compartment was not written by Ashworth, despite his familiarity with the study and his access to it. We returned to the library annex, where Holmes sat in silent contemplation for the better part of an hour. I knew better than to interrupt such reveries, and occupied myself with reviewing my notes from the previous days. Finally, Holmes stirred and reached for his pipe. "Watson," he said, "I begin to perceive the shape of this affair, though the final details remain obscure. Let me present what I believe occurred on the evening of the 21st. I leaned forward attentively. After dinner, The household dispersed according to their stated routines. But two individuals did not remain where they claimed. At some point between 9 and midnight, one of them accessed the study. This person knew of the hidden compartment, knew of the seal within it, and knew how to forge the probate certificate. They worked in the study itself, using the desk, the lamp, the materials at hand. But how did they enter? The door was locked. Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps they did not enter through the door at all, or perhaps they possessed a key they have not acknowledged. But here is the critical point, Watson. While this person worked in the study, another individual moved through the house to a position from which they could observe the corridors. They acted as sentinel, warning of any approach. A conspiracy, then? Holmes nodded. A conspiracy of silence, if not of active participation. Two people at minimum know the truth of that certificate. One created it. The other ensured their privacy while they worked. Whether both are equally guilty or whether one was coerced or manipulated, I cannot yet say. He rose and went to the window where evening was beginning to gather over the snow-covered landscape. Tomorrow, Watson, I shall set a small trap. I shall announce that I have discovered the forger's identity and will reveal it the following morning. Let us see which of our suspects sleeps easily with that knowledge, and which cannot resist attempting to silence me or destroy evidence. Holmes, I protested, that seems unnecessarily dangerous. On the contrary, my friend, it is the only way to force our quarry into the open. Someone in this house has committed forgery, and someone has assisted them. They believe themselves secure behind their careful planning. But I have observed what they did not anticipate anyone would notice. The game, Watson, approaches its end game. As darkness fell and lamps were lit throughout the manor, I could not shake a sense of gathering tension. Holmes had thrown down his challenge. Now we could only wait to see who would accept it. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. Holmes made his announcement at dinner that evening with a theatrical precision that would have done credit to the stage. He waited until the soup had been served and the household had settled into the uneasy rhythm that had characterized our meals together, then set down his spoon with deliberate care. "I have completed my investigation," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the dining room. "Tomorrow morning I shall present my findings to Mr. Carruthers and identify the individual responsible for the forged probate certificate." The effect was immediate and varied. Geoffrey Blackthorne's hand froze midway to his glass. Miss Arabella looked up sharply, her eyes widening. Mrs. Blackthorne remained motionless, though I observed a slight tightening of her jaw. Philip Ashworth continued eating, but his movements became mechanical, lacking their usual ease. Only Carruthers appeared genuinely relieved. "You're certain, Mr. Holmes?" the solicitor asked. "Entirely certain," Holmes replied. "The evidence is conclusive. I require only the night to arrange my presentation in proper order." The remainder of the meal passed in near silence. What little conversation occurred was forced and artificial, dying away almost as soon as it began. When the ladies withdrew, the gentlemen did not linger. Within a quarter hour, the entire household had dispersed to their separate quarters. Holmes and I retired to the library annex, where a fire had been built up against the evening cold. I poured 2 glasses of brandy and settled myself in expectation of learning his conclusions. Instead, he positioned himself in a chair facing the door and withdrew his revolver from his pocket. "Watson," he said quietly, "I expect we shall have a visitor before midnight. Keep your own pistol close to hand. You truly believe someone will attempt violence?" "I believe someone will attempt something," he replied. "Whether violence or persuasion, we shall discover soon enough." The hours passed slowly. The house grew quiet around us, settling into that peculiar stillness that overtakes large buildings in the deep of night. The fire burned low, and I rose once to add coal, wincing at the sound it made as it tumbled onto the grate. It was approaching 11 o'clock when we heard footsteps in the corridor. They approached without stealth, and a moment later came a soft knock upon the door. "Enter," Holmes called. The door opened to reveal Miss Arabella Blackthorne. She wore a dressing gown over her nightdress, and her hair, released from its daytime arrangement, fell loosely about her shoulders. Her face was pale but composed, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with the lateness of the hour. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady, "I must speak with you. May I come in?" Holmes rose and gestured to a chair. "Of course, Miss Blackthorne, please sit down. May I offer you brandy?" She shook her head and settled herself with careful precision, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment she sat in silence, gathering herself, while Holmes waited with patient attention. "Mr. Holmes," she began at last, "I have come to make a confession. I am responsible for the forged probate certificate." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. Holmes's expression did not change, though I confess my own surprise must have been evident. "Please continue, Miss Blackthorne," Holmes said gently. She drew a breath, and I saw her hands tighten in her lap. "My father," she said, "was not the man the world believed him to be. In his youth, before his marriage to my mother, he had formed an attachment to a young woman of unsuitable background. There was a child." She paused, and Holmes waited without prompting. "This child, now grown, came to my father's attention some months ago. The woman, the mother, had died, and the son sought acknowledgement, perhaps even some provision from the estate. My father was torn between his sense of duty and his fear of scandal. He consulted no one, not even Mr. Carruthers. Instead, he wrote a letter acknowledging the relationship and promising a settlement." "And this letter?" Holmes asked. "I found it in his study after his death," she replied. "It was sealed but not sent. Beside it was a note, written in his last days, expressing his intention to amend his will to include this person. He had not done so. Pneumonia took him before he could act." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And you decided to prevent this knowledge from becoming public?" "I decided to protect my father's reputation," she corrected, a note of defiance entering her voice. "He had suffered enough in his final days. The guilt consumed him. I could not bear to see his name tarnished, his memory diminished by revelations that would serve no purpose but to cause pain." "So you forged the probate certificate," Holmes observed. "To what end?" Miss Blackthorne's composure wavered slightly. "I thought," she said slowly, "that if questions were raised about the certificate's authenticity, the entire probate process would be delayed. During that delay, I could find the person making the claim and settle with them privately, using my own settlement from the estate. The scandal could be avoided, and my father's wishes could still be honoured after a fashion." "A remarkably elaborate plan," Holmes remarked. "Tell me, how did you obtain access to Mr. Carruthers's blank certificate?" "I took it from his room while he was at dinner," she replied. "I filled it out in my own chamber, using my father's legal documents as reference. I had found the seal in the hidden compartment while searching the study for the letter. I sealed the certificate and placed it in the drawer, knowing Geoffrey would find it when he next accessed the desk. And the key to the study? I took my father's key ring from his effects. No one thought to question why I wished to have it." Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, "your confession is both detailed and plausible. Yet I must ask, why confess now? You might have remained silent and allowed suspicion to fall elsewhere." For the first time, tears gathered in her eyes, though she blinked them back with determination. "Because I cannot allow an innocent person to be accused, Mr. Holmes. You said you knew who was responsible. If you name someone else tomorrow, the injustice would be insupportable. Better to face the consequences myself than to permit another to suffer for my actions." She rose, and Holmes rose with her. "I assume," she said, "that you will inform Mr. Carruthers and summon the authorities once the roads are clear." "That will depend upon several factors," Holmes replied carefully. "For now, I suggest you return to your chamber and rest. We shall speak further in the morning." When she'd gone, I turned to Holmes in astonishment. "Do you believe her?" He moved to the fire and stood gazing into its depths. "Her confession, Watson, is a masterpiece of careful construction. Every detail meshes perfectly with the known facts. The motive is sympathetic, the method is plausible, and the timing of her revelation is calculated to evoke maximum credibility. Then she is guilty. Holmes turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes a gleam of something very like triumph. She is guilty, Watson, of offering herself as a sacrifice. But she is not guilty of forgery. Her confession is precisely what it appears to be: convenient, complete, and utterly false. But why would she confess to a crime she did not commit? To protect someone else, Holmes replied. Someone she cares for deeply. Someone who stands to lose everything if the truth emerges. She has constructed her confession with great care, Watson, but she has made one critical error. What error? She claimed to have found the seal in the hidden compartment while searching for her father's letter. But that compartment could only be opened by knowing its precise location and mechanism. I discovered it myself only through systematic examination. Miss Blackthorne could not have found it by chance, nor could she have known of its existence unless someone told her. And if someone told her, then that person is the true forger, and she is merely attempting to shield them from exposure. He returned to his chair and reached for his brandy. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall accept her confession with appropriate gravity. We shall thank her for her honesty and express our sympathy for her situation, and then we shall watch very carefully to see who breathes most easily with the belief that the matter is closed. That person, my friend, will lead us to the truth. I struggle to comprehend the complexity of the deception. Someone forged the certificate. Miss Blackthorne knows who, but offers herself instead, and you will pretend to accept her story. I will do more than pretend, Holmes said. I will appear to have been entirely taken in by her performance. Only thus can we observe the true culprit's reaction when they believe themselves safe. It is a dangerous game, Watson, for if I am wrong, an innocent woman will face prosecution. But I am not wrong. The evidence speaks clearly to those who know how to read it. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in my bed, listening to the wind and the creaking of the old house, and wondered at the depths of loyalty that would drive a young woman to confess to a crime she had not committed. Yet whatever secrets Blackthorne Manor held, they were bound up in ties of affection and duty that ran deeper than mere law. And somewhere in this house, the true forger now believed themselves saved by Miss Blackthorne's sacrifice. Tomorrow would reveal whether Holmes's confidence was justified, or whether we had witnessed a confession that was, after all, entirely true. Chapter 8. Confidence in Error. The following morning brought a change in the weather. The leaden sky had cleared somewhat, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds to cast long shadows across the snow. At breakfast, Holmes behaved as though nothing of consequence had occurred during the night. He conversed pleasantly with Mr. Carruthers about matters entirely unrelated to our investigation, and inquired politely after the health of various household members. It was not until we had assembled in the library at 10 o'clock that he addressed the matter at hand. The family gathered with evident apprehension, taking their accustomed places while Holmes stood before the fireplace, his lean figure silhouetted against the flames. "Mr. Carruthers, ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I am grateful for your patience during my investigation. I am now in a position to resolve the matter of the probate certificate." He paused, and I observed the assembled faces. Mrs. Blackthorne sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Geoffrey Blackthorne leaned forward anxiously. Philip Ashworth had positioned himself near the window, affecting an air of casual interest that did not quite mask his tension. Miss Arabella alone appeared calm, almost serene, her eyes fixed upon Holmes with steady composure. "Last evening," Holmes continued, "I was visited by Miss Arabella Blackthorne, who made a full confession regarding the forged certificate. She has explained both her motives and her methods in detail. I have examined her account and find it entirely consistent with the physical evidence." "Arabella!" Mrs. Blackthorne's exclamation broke the silence. Her stepdaughter turned to her with a slight smile. "It is quite all right, Leonora," she said softly. "I have done what was necessary." Geoffrey rose from his chair, his face flushed. "This is absurd, Mr. Holmes. My sister could not possibly have done such a thing. There must be some mistake." Holmes raised a hand. "Please, Mr. Blackthorne, allow me to continue. Miss Blackthorne has acted by her own admission from the noblest of motives. She sought to protect your father's reputation and to prevent scandal from touching this family. Her actions, while legally questionable, were driven by filial loyalty of the highest order." Carruthers cleared his throat. "Mr. Holmes, what do you propose we do with this information?" "That," Holmes replied, "is not for me to determine. I am merely an investigator. The decision of whether to pursue legal action rests with you and with the family. However, I would note that Miss Blackthorne has caused no material harm. The will itself is valid, and no one has been deprived of their rightful inheritance. The forged certificate was, in essence, a desperate attempt to buy time for a private resolution." He moved from the fireplace and approached Miss Arabella, who rose to meet him. I stood watching, marvelling at the performance. Such a performance it surely was. Holmes appeared entirely convinced, his manner sympathetic and understanding. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, "I admire your courage in coming forward. Not everyone would have the strength to do so." She inclined her head gracefully. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I could not have lived with the alternative." The family began to speak at once, voices overlapping in confusion and protest. Mrs. Blackthorne moved to her stepdaughter's side, placing a protective hand upon her arm. Geoffrey continued to insist that some error had been made. Only Ashworth remained apart, and I saw him watching the scene with an expression I could not quite interpret. Holmes allowed the commotion to continue for several minutes before raising his voice to restore order. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, I suggest that Mr. Carruthers confer with the family privately to determine the appropriate course of action. Dr. Watson and I shall withdraw to allow you that privacy." We retired to the annex, and the moment the door closed behind us, Holmes's demeanour changed entirely. The sympathetic investigator vanished, replaced by the keen observer I knew so well. "Now, Watson," he said quietly, "we wait and watch. Someone in that room is breathing easier than they should be. Someone believes themselves saved by Miss Blackthorne's sacrifice. Our task is to identify that person through their behaviour in the hours to come." "But how?" I asked. "They are all relieved. Even Mrs. Blackthorne seems grateful that the matter is resolved." "Relieved, yes," Holmes agreed. "But there are degrees of relief. The innocent are merely pleased that the uncertainty has ended. The guilty are profoundly grateful to have escaped detection. The difference lies in what they do next." He positioned himself at the window, from which he could observe the entrance to the library without being seen himself. I joined him, and together we maintained our vigil. Within half an hour the family began to emerge. Mrs. Blackthorne appeared first, supporting Miss Arabella, who seemed suddenly fragile in the bright morning light. They crossed the entrance hall and ascended the stairs together, their heads close in conversation. Geoffrey followed shortly after, his face troubled. He did not go upstairs, but instead made his way toward the estate office, his stride purposeful. Ashworth was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway of the library, glanced about the entrance hall, then moved quickly toward the north wing where his chamber lay. Holmes watched him go with narrowed eyes. "Interesting," he murmured. "Most interesting. What do you observe?" "A man in haste, Watson. A man who has suddenly remembered something that requires his immediate attention." Before I could respond, Holmes was moving. He left the annex and crossed the entrance hall with rapid, silent steps, gesturing for me to follow. We mounted the stairs and proceeded along the corridor toward the guest chambers. At the blue room, Holmes paused and pressed his ear to the door. I could hear sounds from within, the opening and closing of drawers, the rustle of papers, movement both urgent and careful. Holmes withdrew slightly and nodded to himself, as though confirming some private theory. Then, to my surprise, he knocked firmly upon the door. The sounds within ceased abruptly. After a moment, Ashworth's voice called out, "Who is it?" Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Ashworth. Might I have a word?" There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened to reveal Ashworth, his face flushed and his breathing slightly elevated. "Mr. Holmes," he said, forcing a smile, "I was just organising some papers. Please, come in." We entered to find the writing desk in considerable disarray. Papers were scattered across its surface, and several drawers stood open. The wastepaper basket had been emptied onto the floor. Holmes surveyed the scene with apparent mild interest. "Spring cleaning, Mr. Ashworth?" "After a fashion," the cousin replied, moving to stand between us and the desk. "I thought to put my affairs in order before departing. The road should be passable within a day or two." "Quite so." Holmes agreed. "Tell me, have you had opportunity to speak with Miss Blackthorne this morning?" Ashworth's eyes flickered briefly toward the desk before returning to Holmes. "Only in the library with the others. A terrible business. I confess I am shocked that gentle Arabella could have acted so." Holmes moved casually about the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are fond of her, I perceive." "She is my cousin's daughter," Ashworth said carefully. "I've known her since childhood. Naturally, I feel protective toward her." "Naturally," Holmes echoed. He paused before the fireplace and gazed down at the grate. "You have had a fire this morning." "The room was cold when I woke," Ashworth replied. "The servants were late in attending to it, so I lit it myself." Holmes knelt and examined the ashes with his lens. "Indeed. And you burned papers as well as coal, I see." Ashworth's composure slipped fractionally. "Old correspondence, nothing of consequence. As I said, I was putting my affairs in order." Holmes rose and brushed off his hands. "Of course." "Well, I shall not intrude further upon your privacy. Good day, Mr. Ashworth." We withdrew, and I followed Holmes back to the annex in puzzled silence. Once there, he turned to me with grim satisfaction. "He has destroyed evidence, Watson. Documents he believed were safely concealed, but which he now fears might incriminate him. Miss Blackthorne's confession has given him the confidence to eliminate what remains, certain that the investigation is closed." "But what documents?" I asked. "That," Holmes replied, "is what we must determine. But I observed several facts during our brief visit. The ink stains on his fingers are fresh. He has been writing extensively this morning, not merely sorting old papers. The ashes in his fireplace contain fragments of heavy paper, the sort used for legal documents, and most tellingly, there was an odour in that room that I've encountered before in this case." "What odour?" "The faint, distinctive scent of sealing wax, Watson. The same wax we found in the hidden compartment. Ashworth has been in possession of materials used in the forgery, and he has just destroyed them." Holmes moved to his own desk and began making notes in his precise hand. "Tonight, Watson, we shall conduct one final examination of the study. I wish to verify certain details before tomorrow's revelation. For tomorrow we shall assemble the household once more, and this time the truth shall emerge in its entirety." You know who forged the certificate?" "I know," Holmes replied, "and I know why. But more than that, Watson, I know what the forgery was meant to conceal, and that knowledge changes everything. This case is not merely about probate certificates and legal technicalities. It is about love, duty, and the terrible choices people make when those two forces collide." He would say no more, and I was left to wait through the long afternoon, wondering what revelation the following day would bring. Chapter 9. The Reconstruction. The household assembled in the library at 10 o'clock the following morning, with the air of participants in a drama whose final act had already been played. The relief that had marked their previous gathering had settled into a kind of resigned acceptance. Miss Arabella sat beside her stepmother, her composure absolute. Geoffrey stood near the window, his expression troubled but no longer anxious. Philip Ashworth occupied his accustomed position by the bookshelves, outwardly relaxed. Mr. Carruthers arrived last, carrying a leather portfolio. He took his seat and nodded to Holmes, who rose from his chair with that controlled energy I had come to recognise as the prelude to revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, I have asked you to assemble this morning because I have a confession to make. Yesterday, when I accepted Miss Blackthorne's account of events, I was not entirely truthful with you." The room grew very still. Miss Arabella's hands tightened in her lap, but she did not speak. Holmes continued, his voice even and measured. "Miss Blackthorne did indeed confess to forging the probate certificate. Her account was detailed, plausible, and delivered with admirable courage. There was only one difficulty with it. It was not true." Arabella rose to her feet, her face pale. "Mr. Holmes, I told you exactly what occurred. I swear it." Holmes raised a hand gently. "Miss Blackthorne, please sit down. I do not doubt your sincerity. Indeed, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for another speaks to the nobility of your character. But I cannot permit an innocent person to bear the consequences of another's actions, however well-intentioned that protection may be." He moved to the centre of the room, commanding every eye. "Let me reconstruct what actually occurred, beginning with the facts that cannot be disputed. Mr. Henry Blackthorne died on the 15th of January. His will, properly executed and witnessed, was read to the family by Mr. Carruthers on the 20th. On the evening of the 21st, the first heavy snow began, sealing this household from the outside world. On the morning of the 22nd, Mr. Geoffrey Blackthorne discovered a probate certificate in a locked drawer of his father's study. He paused, allowing the timeline to settle in every mind. The certificate purported to have been validated in London on the 23rd of January. Yet no one could have travelled to or from London after the 21st. Therefore, the certificate was either placed in the drawer before the snow began, or it was forged here in this house. Miss Blackthorne confessed to the latter. She claimed to have taken a blank certificate from Mr. Carruthers's papers, filled it out in her chamber, sealed it with a false seal, and placed it in the drawer. A tidy explanation, less marred by one insurmountable difficulty. "What difficulty?" Geoffrey demanded. Holmes turned to him. "Your sister claimed to have discovered the seal in a hidden compartment within your father's desk, but that compartment can only be opened by those who know its precise location and mechanism. I discovered it myself through systematic examination. Miss Blackthorne could not have found it by chance. Someone told her of its existence, and that someone, ladies and gentlemen, is the true forger." He crossed to the desk where Mr. Carruthers sat and withdrew from his pocket several sheets of paper. "Last night, Dr. Watson and I conducted a final examination of the study. We found, wedged behind one of the drawers, a fragment of paper that had fallen there unnoticed. Upon this fragment was written, in a distinctive hand, a draft of the wording used on the forged certificate. He held up the paper for all to see. This hand does not belong to Miss Blackthorne, nor does it belong to Mr. Geoffrey Blackthorne, to Mrs. Blackthorne, or to Mr. Garrett. It belongs, beyond any possibility of doubt, to Mr. Philip Ashworth." Every head turned toward the cousin, who had gone very white but remained standing with rigid composure. "Impossible," Ashworth said, his voice strained. "I was in my chamber that entire evening. I wrote letters. I prepared for bed. I had no access to the study." Holmes smiled faintly. "You had access, Mr. Ashworth, because you possessed a key. Not your cousin's key, which remained in the possession of Mr. Garrett and young Mr. Blackthorne, but a key you had obtained years earlier, when your visits to this house were more frequent and your relationship with its master was more intimate." "What are you suggesting?" Mrs. Blackthorne's voice was sharp. Holmes turned to her with an expression of profound sympathy. "Madam, I am suggesting that your late husband and Mr. Ashworth were engaged in a business arrangement that went beyond the bounds of strict legality. The hidden compartment in the study contained not merely a seal and wax, but also a letter written in a feminine hand. That letter, I believe, was written by you." The widow stood, her face ashen. "Mr. Holmes, you overstep yourself." "I overstep nothing," Holmes replied gently. "I merely state facts that can be proven. The letter speaks of gratitude for assistance and hope for a future unburdened by the past. It is undated and unsigned, but the hand is yours, Mrs. Blackthorne. I've compared it to notes you wrote for the household staff. He moved closer to her, his voice dropping to a tone of kindness. You and Henry Blackthorne were not always married, were you, madam? There was a time, perhaps 25 years ago, when you were a young woman in circumstances very different from these. You and Mr. Ashworth formed an attachment. There may even have been a child. No, Mrs. Blackthorne whispered, but her denial lacked conviction. Henry Blackthorne knew of this. Perhaps he learned of it after your marriage, perhaps before. But rather than cast you aside, he offered protection. He married you, gave the child his name, and raised Geoffrey as his own son. In return, you gave him loyalty and the appearance of respectability he required. It was a practical arrangement, and by all accounts, it served you both well. Geoffrey had risen to his feet, his face a mask of shock. Father was not my father? Holmes turned to him with compassion. Your father in every way that matters, Mr. Blackthorne. He chose to be your father. That choice speaks more to his character than any accident of birth. He returned his attention to Ashworth, who had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. Mr. Ashworth, Holmes said, you are Geoffrey's natural father. You and Mrs. Blackthorne have maintained this secret for a quarter century. But Henry Blackthorne, in his final days, was troubled by the deception. He wrote a letter, which he had Mr. Garrett witness, acknowledging the truth and expressing his intention to amend his will accordingly. Not to disinherit Geoffrey, but to ensure that all parties were treated with fairness and that the truth would be known after his death. That letter, Holmes continued, would have destroyed everything. It would have exposed the secret, called Geoffrey's legitimacy into question, and potentially affected the inheritance. So you, Mr. Ashworth, decided to act. You knew that if questions were raised about the probate process, if the estate came under scrutiny, that letter might be discovered and made public. You needed a distraction, something to focus attention away from your cousin's final wishes. Ashworth looked up, his face haggard. I only wanted to protect them. To protect Leonora and Geoffrey. By forging a probate certificate? Holmes asked. A document that would inevitably draw scrutiny. Not inevitably, Ashworth replied, his voice hollow. I thought if Carruthers noticed the irregularities, he would assume a clerical error. The certificate would be questioned, but not the will itself. During the confusion, I could retrieve Henry's letter and destroy it. No one would ever know the truth. But you miscalculated, Holmes said. Mr. Carruthers is a man of excessive caution. He brought in an outside investigator rather than accepting the simple explanation. And you found yourself trapped in this house, unable to retrieve the letter because the study remained locked and observed. Where is this letter now? Carruthers asked quietly. Holmes withdrew another paper from his pocket. Here. I found it last night, exactly where Mr. Garrett indicated Henry Blackthorne had placed it after having it witnessed. It was sealed and addressed to Mr. Carruthers, a mark to be opened only after probate was complete. He handed it to the solicitor, who broke the seal and read in silence. When he looked up, his expression was grave but not unkind. Mr. Blackthorne's wishes are clear, he said. The will stands as written. Geoffrey receives the estate. But Henry wanted the truth known, wanted his choice to raise Geoffrey as his son to be understood as an act of love rather than ignorance. Holmes turned to Miss Arabella, who had remained silent throughout the revelation. Miss Blackthorne, you knew much of this, did you not? Your father confided in you during his final days. She nodded slowly. He told me everything. He wanted me to understand why he had made certain choices. When the certificate appeared and suspicions arose, I feared the truth would emerge in a way that would destroy Mother and Geoffrey. So I offered myself as the culprit, hoping to end the investigation before it reached the deeper secret. A noble impulse, Holmes said, but ultimately unnecessary. The truth, when told complete and in proper context, need not destroy. It can instead illuminate and even heal. He addressed the room entire. Henry Blackthorne was a man who chose love over pride, duty over convention. He deserves to be remembered not as deceived, but as honourable. Mr. Ashworth acted foolishly, but from protective instinct. I suggest that the forged certificate be quietly destroyed, the genuine probate process completed, and Mr. Blackthorne's letter be treated as the private family document it was always intended to be. Carruthers closed his portfolio. I concur, Mr. Holmes. The will is valid. The inheritance is clear. What remains is for the family to decide. Geoffrey crossed to where his mother sat and took her hand. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes, and he smiled with a gentleness that spoke of understanding beyond words. Ashworth remained seated, a broken figure. Miss Arabella moved to his side and placed a hand upon his shoulder. "We have all done what we believed necessary," she said quietly. "Perhaps now we might simply do what is right." The tension that had gripped Blackthorne Manor for days dissolved like morning mist. What remained was not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of truth, and with it, the possibility of genuine peace. Chapter 10. Order Restored. The thaw came that very afternoon, as though nature itself had awaited the resolution of human affairs before releasing its grip upon the land. I stood at the window of our chamber, watching rivulets of water run from the eaves and listening to the steady drip of melting snow. The oppressive isolation that had hung over Blackthorne Manor was lifting with the weather, and I felt the household breathe easier for it. Holmes sat in a chair by the fire, his pipe sending up lazy spirals of smoke. He had been silent since our return from the library, lost in that particular reverie that sometimes followed the conclusion of a case. I had learned long ago not to disturb such moments, for they were as essential to his nature as the investigation itself. It was approaching evening when he finally spoke. "You are wondering, Watson, why I did not expose the forgery immediately upon discovering it." I turned from the window. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted. You knew within the first day that the certificate was false, yet you allowed the investigation to proceed for several days more. Holmes knocked the ash from his pipe into the grate. "Because the forgery itself was merely a symptom, Watson, not the disease. A forged document appeared in a locked room under impossible circumstances. That fact alone told me that whoever created it possessed both intimate knowledge of this house and desperate motivation. But what motivation could drive such an elaborate deception?" He rose and began to pace, as was his habit when explaining his reasoning. "Consider the facts as they presented themselves. A man dies, apparently of natural causes. His will is straightforward and uncontested, yet someone goes to extraordinary lengths to create a false probate certificate that changes nothing in the disposition of the estate. Why? The obvious answer was that the forgery served as a distraction from something else, something the forger feared would be discovered during the normal probate process. "Henry Blackthorne's letter," I said. "Precisely. But I did not know of that letter initially. I knew only that something was being concealed, something of sufficient gravity to justify the risk of forgery. So I set about understanding the relationships within this household, the tensions beneath the surface civility, the glances and silences that spoke louder than words." He returned to his chair and relit his pipe. "Mr. Garrett provided the first clue when he mentioned witnessing a document the night before Blackthorne's death. A document that troubled his master's conscience. Mrs. Blackthorne revealed that her husband was burdened by some private concern in his final weeks. Miss Arabella demonstrated knowledge she should not have possessed, and Mr. Ashworth betrayed himself through a dozen small actions, each insignificant alone but damning in aggregate. The Turkish tobacco, I recalled, his familiarity with the study, the burning of documents. Indeed. But more than these physical details, Watson, it was his behaviour that revealed him. He was too interested in the certificate, too eager to dismiss it as a clerical error, too quick to establish his movements on the critical evening. An innocent man would have shown curiosity or concern. A guilty man shows calculation, and Miss Blackthorne's confession Holmes smiled faintly. A remarkable young woman, Watson. She had pieced together much of the truth from her father's deathbed confidences and her own observations. When she realized my investigation was approaching the deeper secret, she offered herself as a sacrifice to protect those she loved. It was an act of considerable courage, though misguided. You knew immediately it was false. The moment she claimed to have discovered the hidden compartment by accident, I knew she was protecting someone, but her confession served my purposes admirably. It gave the true forger confidence that the investigation had concluded. That confidence led him to destroy evidence he had kept hidden, evidence whose destruction I was able to observe and document. I considered all he had revealed. Holmes, I said, there is one aspect I still do not fully understand. Why did Henry Blackthorne choose to acknowledge the truth after maintaining the deception for 25 years? Holmes gazed into the fire, his expression thoughtful. I can only speculate, Watson, but I believe it was precisely because he had maintained the deception for so long that he felt compelled to correct it at the end. He had given Geoffrey his name, his love, and his estate. But he wanted Geoffrey to know that these gifts were chosen, not obligated. That he was a father by decision rather than by accident of blood. There was a nobility in that, I observed. There was, Holmes agreed. And in recognizing it, we see the measure of the man. He could have taken his secret to the grave, left everything neat and uncomplicated. Instead, he chose truth over convenience, knowing it might cause pain but believing it would ultimately bring peace. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. At Holmes's invitation, Mr. Carruthers entered, his leather portfolio under his arm. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "I wish to speak with you before you depart tomorrow. The family has asked me to convey their gratitude for your discretion in this matter." Holmes waved away the thanks. "I merely uncovered truth, Mr. Carruthers. What the family chooses to do with it is their concern, not mine." The solicitor settled himself in the remaining chair. "Nevertheless, you handled a delicate situation with admirable tact. I confess I was uncertain how to proceed when I first noticed the irregularities in the certificate. Bringing in a detective seemed extreme. Yet the law required certainty." "You acted correctly," Holmes assured him. "Tell me, what will become of Mr. Ashworth?" Carruthers sighed. "No charges will be brought. The forged certificate will be destroyed, and the genuine probate will proceed as though this incident never occurred. Mr. Ashworth has agreed to return to the colonies within the month. It is felt that distance will serve everyone's interests. And Geoffrey Blackthorne, how has he received the revelation?" "With remarkable grace," the solicitor replied. "He has spoken privately with his mother and with Mr. Ashworth. Whatever was said between them remains their affair, but I observed no rancour, only a kind of melancholy understanding." "Miss Blackthorne has been a steadying influence upon them all," Holmes nodded. "She strikes me as a young woman of exceptional character. She will do well in life." After Carruthers had departed, Holmes and I sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered beyond the windows. The sounds of the house settling around us were peaceful now, no longer weighted with tension and unspoken fears. "Watson," Holmes said eventually, "you will write this case up for your collection, I presume?" "I had considered it," I replied, "though I am uncertain how much should be revealed. The family's privacy must be respected. Then change the names, alter the location, shift the details as you see fit. But preserve the essential truth of it, Watson. That truth lies not in what is declared, but in what quietly contradicts the possible. That a locked room is never truly locked when human ingenuity is involved. That motives are layered like geological strata, and one must dig deep to reach bedrock. And most importantly, that the finest deductions are worthless if they are not tempered with understanding and compassion." "I shall endeavour to capture all of that," I said. "See that you do," he replied with a slight smile, "and do try to make me somewhat less infallible in your account. The public expects drama, not perfection." The following morning brought clear skies and the sound of wheels upon gravel as the roads opened once more to traffic. We departed Blackthorn Manor shortly after breakfast. The family assembled in the entrance hall to bid us farewell. Mrs. Blackthorn pressed Holmes's hand with quiet gratitude. Geoffrey shook it firmly, his eyes conveying what words could not. Miss Arabella favoured us both with a smile that suggested relief and something approaching joy. As our carriage descended the long drive, I looked back at the manor, its honey-coloured stone bright in the winter sun. The snow that had imprisoned us was melting rapidly, revealing the grounds beneath. In another week, no trace of that isolating whiteness would remain. Holmes, I observed, you said this case was about love, duty, and terrible choices. Having seen its resolution, I would add hope to that list. He considered this, then nodded. Perhaps you are right, Watson. Henry Blackthorn chose duty over easy concealment. Philip Ashworth chose protection over self-preservation. Arabella Blackthorn chose sacrifice over safety. And in the end, they all chose to accept truth rather than comfortable illusion. There is hope in such choices. And what of you? I asked. What did you choose? Holmes looked out at the passing countryside, his expression distant. I chose to remember that behind every crime, every deception, every desperate act, there are human beings struggling with circumstances beyond their control. The law may demand punishment, Watson, but justice sometimes requires mercy. I am grateful that in this instance both could be served. We travelled the remainder of the journey in silence, each occupied with his own thoughts. The case of the forged probate certificate was closed, its secrets laid to rest. But the lessons it had taught about the complexity of human nature and the fine line between right and wrong would remain with me for years to come. It stands now in my collection as a reminder that the greatest mysteries are not those of locked rooms and impossible crimes, but those of the human heart where motives intertwine and truth is rarely simple. And in solving such mysteries I had learned one required not merely the brilliant deductions of a Sherlock Holmes, but the wisdom to know when those deductions should lead not to condemnation, but to understanding, the end.